Hello again, everyone. Since we live on the East Coast, we had some snow this past week, so the students weren't in the lab to perform any work. But I came in and did a little bit of work that I'm going to share with you today. I'm also going to show you how I performed a leak down test on this 5.7 Hemi engine that's sitting in front of me. Thanks for tuning in. This is a 5.7 Hemi engine out of a 2007 Chrysler 300. We didn't have the key to it, so we never heard it run before we pulled the engine, but there is a way to check how sound the engine is internally, and that's by performing a cylinder leakage test. So what we need to do first is get the number one cylinder on top dead center. We're going to introduce compressed air into it, and then measure the percentage of leakage from that cylinder, and we'll do the same thing with the other 7 cylinders on this engine. So again, by getting this on top dead center number one, what I've done is I've taken the spark plug out. I've got a rod here sitting on top of the piston, and I'm going to rotate the engine by hand until we get the rod to its highest point of travel. Then we know that we are on top dead center. Now we don't know if that's the exhaust stroke or not unless we take off the valve covers, because there is no mark on the front of the engine. But if we do a leakage test on that cylinder and it's on the exhaust stroke, we're going to get 100% leakage out of the exhaust. Then we know we're 360 out and we can start the process over again. Assuming that it might be a little hard to see, I put a piece of tape on that rod. If you watch it closer, you can see we're going up. Still going up. And right there we peak. So the piston's on top dead center now. Now we can do our leak down test on this cylinder. In doing the editing, I saw that there was too much glare on the gauges, so I wanted to show you these and point these out so you'll see, or at least understand what's really going on. The gauge on the left is applied pressure, so however much pressure I put into the cylinder itself will show up on that gauge. The gauge to the right is a differential gauge, so what it's going to show is how much pressure is in the cylinder versus how much is leaking. So for example, if I put 100 psi into the cylinder and I have 20% leakage, that means 80% is staying in the cylinder and 20% is leaking past the rings or possibly a valve or something like that. So that's how how these things are read, and then that'll tell us what the condition of the engine is internally. And let's see how this engine tests out. With the engine at top dead center on number one, we're ready to do our leak down test. So the first thing we're going to do is screw in our adapter where the spark plug will go. It's got an O-ring at the bottom of it to seal it, so we just need to put it in hand tight. So the bottom's out. We'll hook our gauge up, like so. Now we're going to start introducing air into the cylinder and then watching the difference in the gauges. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put up about 80 to 90 pounds of pressure. Alright, so there's 80. You can see we're showing 100% leakage, so that means I can hear the air here coming from the exhaust, so that means we are 360 out, so we're going to have to rotate the engine over to get onto the number one compression stroke. After rotating at 360 degrees, you can still see we have 100% leakage and it's still coming out of the exhaust. So we've got an exhaust valve that's not closing. It could be from the engine sitting so long that the valve is stuck off the seat. It could be something more mechanical than that. So what I'm going to do is pull the valve cover off real quick and see if there's something in there that's causing that valve to hang open, or the engine just may not be any good. Mechanically, we look good. Don't see anything bent, but clearly that exhaust valve is not seating. It could just be because it hadn't run in a very long time, and maybe that valve had hung open for a while, had some carbon buildup or whatever. Because both rocker arms are loose and no pressure is put on the valves, I know that we're at top dead center number one here. But yeah, we still have air leaking from the exhaust, so we know the valve is not on its seat fully. I don't see any signs of it being bent, so I'm assuming there might be some carbon there. Before we decide that the engine is completely no good, I'd like to at least check one more cylinder. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check number 3. Now the next one in the firing order would be number 8, which is the back one on the other side, but I'm already set up here. So I'm going to rotate it enough times to get the cylinder 3. The firing order is 18436572. So what I've done here, as you can see on the crankshaft, I put some marks there with tape every 90 degrees, since every 90 degrees is a firing impulse for the engine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate each one 90 degrees, counting 1843, and then once I get to where number 3 is on top dead center compression, then I'm going to check this cylinder and see where we are. So with our tape marks here, this is number 1 top dead center. We don't have any marks here. So again, knowing that every firing impulse is 90 degrees apart, I can rotate this clockwise and then count each one. So this is cylinder 1, 8, 4, 3. So when this one gets around to top dead center, then I know number 3 is at top dead center compression stroke. That's 8. Cylinder 4. Now we should be coming up cylinder 3. Right about there. With number 3 at top dead center and our adapter in, we're going to hook up our gauge and see what we get on this cylinder. Okay, so this needle's moving now, which is a good sign that we're actually creating pressure in the cylinder. So let's push him on up to 90 or 100. That's 80. That's 90. There's 100 pounds in the cylinder. Now, what we're showing here is a little over 40% leakage out of the cylinder, but that's probably past the rings. Remember, this engine hadn't run in a really long time, so there's no oil in the cylinders to help create that seal at the rings like it normally would. So they're calling this moderate. 20% leakage is what they call normal typically, 20% or less. We're over that, but odds are that if we shot a little oil in the engine, got it cranked over good to help saturate the rings, to help create that seal, that's going to raise our leak down percentage, or lower it actually, the percentage to 20 or less. So I'm feeling pretty confident about this cylinder at least, but that doesn't explain the exhaust leaking on number 1. So I think we're going to go ahead and check a couple more cylinders, at least the other ones on this side, and then we'll determine what we're going to do from there. In testing cylinder 7, you can see that we have 100% cylinder leakage there. I'm going to open the intake here. I don't know if you can hear it over top of the air that's leaking from the hose, but there's a lot of air leaking past that into the plenum. So our intake valve is leaking. However, the intake valve is shut, at least as far as it can shut, because there is movement on the rocker arm, so we know that the valve is shut. What I'm going to attempt to do here very briefly is take a hammer and tap on the top of the rocker arm, put some pressure on that valve, see if I can get the needle to move any. And I can't. So that's some pretty hard carbon in there, or a pretty severe leak in this engine. So probably again from sitting for a really long time. The heads are going to have to come off and maybe have the head work done on it, machine the valves or whatever, to get it cleaned up, and then this could be a good running engine. A couple of readings I was getting earlier were a little strange, so I wanted to make sure that the valves were actually moving and hadn't jumped time, so I can see that they are. So I'm going to do the whole test all over again with all 8 cylinders and actually see what we have. With this being an 8-cylinder engine and the firing impulses being 90 degrees apart for the 720 degrees of rotation that it takes to complete a full cycle with this engine, I've got it marked off into quarters every 90 degrees. So right now, with this one being at 12 o'clock, pointing directly to the water pump, I can rotate the engine 90 degrees and hit the next one in the firing order. The firing order of this engine, as it's been for many decades, is 18436572. So knowing that we just did number 1 and this is number 1, I'm going to rotate the engine 90 degrees, and that's going to put cylinder number 8 at top dead center compression, and I can run that test and then continue through the whole cycle until I've done all 8 cylinders. So we'll just rotate this until we get the next mark, or a piece of tape pointing directly up to the water pump, and that puts number 8 at top dead center. Cylinder 8 at top dead center. I'll go ahead and put our adapter in. Cylinder 8 hole. Secured. Put our gauge back over and hook it up. Then we'll do the same thing. Introduce air into the cylinder. And again, 100% leakage, clearly coming from the exhaust. Check the intake as well, but definitely the exhaust. We'll continue that through all the cycles, or all ordered cylinders of the engine, and we'll see if we actually have any that are any good. As I said, the next one in the firing order was number 4, and that's where we are now. And you can see we're almost in the green, but not quite. But that can be explained by the fact that the engine hasn't run in a long time, so there's no oil on cylinder walls to create a seal for the piston ring. So actually that's encouraging that there is at least one cylinder so far that would have compression if it was we were trying to start it. So anyway, this one's actually showing up pretty good, and we're going to continue again with the test. Here's the readings we got from our leak down test. You can see cylinder 5 is the only one that falls within the percentage of being okay at 20% leakage. Cylinder 3 is at 30, 4 and 6 are at 40%, which is a little more than we want. But again, as I said earlier, if we put a little oil in the cylinder, it would bring that number down significantly, which means we'd have more pressure. Then you can see the 4 outer cylinders at 100% leakage, and mostly from the exhaust valve side. So since none of these are side by side, so there's no head gasket issues or camshaft issues or anything like that, we have to assume that the valves just have some carbon buildup, and taking the heads off and cleaning them up and reseating them and all should take care of it, but we'll have to make a decision as to whether or not we're going to follow through with that. I've got my replacement crank gear for my Fordson tractor engine, and I've got my puller set hooked up here. I've got a slide hammer set up, so I've got the jaws around the old gear here, pushing in from the center of the crankshaft here, and then turning it in. So I've got this turned nice and tight. I've got the jam nut nice and tight so we don't damage our threads. Now we'll just use the slide hammer and see if it works. So I'm hoping I don't have to heat it up or even use the hydraulic press for this, but we'll see. Let's see if we can get this thing off this way. We are making a bit of progress. But I think we can make a little more. What I'm going to do is use our air chisel to bump it from the back to release some of the tension, hopefully from the key, and then continue using the slide hammer at the same time. Looks like it did bring it up some because this is now turning. Looks like it's coming more. I can see that the key is moving in a little bit, so I mean the gear is coming over top of it. So it looks like we are making progress, slow but sure. She'll move now. Considerable amount of movement there. Keep the jam nut tight. That keeps from damaging the threads. Almost as aggravating as that wheel bearing we had a couple weeks ago, but not quite as bad. You see, this is loose now considerably, so it is coming off, but we definitely want to keep pressure on it while we're using the slide hammer. I think one more hit with the air chisel might do it. Not actually what I had in mind, but it seemed to work. I think I'm still going to put the puller on it though, to get it off the rest of the way, but we can do that. And now, I'm going to hold the crankshaft and turn it. So we will put a pry bar, actually, this would be better. There's a wooden handle. We'll hold that, keep it from rotating. And we should just be able to get a nice even pull. Almost off the key. And we should be able to slide it right off from there. There we go. Now we can take the gear off. And you can really see how bad that gear really was. I'm going to clean the shaft up really good, get rid of the shavings that we created with the air chisel. And then we're going to slide this thing right back on the key. And we're ready to put the cam in. The end of the crankshaft is cleaned up nice, and the gear was already sandblasted, I guess, before they shipped it to me from Michigan. I want to make sure that, first of all, it's easy that it goes on that key, so it'll line up, but make sure that that 0 mark right there does end up facing out. So that's what we're going to use when we time the cam. So we'll put this on like so, get it lined up on that key. And normally I would want to use a big piece of pipe that goes around this, and I would knock it on with the sledgehammer that way. but I don't have one that big here, so I'm going to use a brass drift and a 5-pound sledgehammer and try to gently push it on side to side. Walk it on the key. You don't want to shatter the gear. Now again, I'm using a brass punch so that I don't do any damage to the gear itself. The punch will absorb the impact force and not break it. Just about there. You know how many times my students would have already hit themselves in the hand, or how many times I would have done that when I was younger? Doing this is a skill set all in and of itself. And I'm not looking at the punch, I'm looking at the gear. Just about there. We should hear it hit pretty solid here shortly. Thank you for there. Now the next thing we'll do is we'll get the camshaft put in and get this thing timed, and it'll be ready for the front cover. This is the first startup for the Honda Civic. I've got everything hooked up, all the fluids are in it. Put the key in. I'm going to cycle it a couple times to build some fuel pressure. Make sure we don't have any leaks. Give it a crank. Not a bad sign, got to build up some oil pressure. Try it again. There we go. Sounds pretty good, no exhaust leaks. Running really smooth even though we didn't put in new plugs. But we will with an air filter. Just want to make sure everything was running properly first. I'll check the dash now to make sure there's no check engine light or any other lights on the dash. We'll be ready for a test drive soon. One of my past graduates, James Goodall, who works for Worthman Ford of Alexandria, stopped by and needed to put in a sway bar link for this car behind me. Sway bar link's job is to handle body roll when you get into turns to keep the body level. And so he's putting one of those in that's bad, and this is the new one here. So as soon as he gets that one off, we'll install this new one, and I'll take care of that clunking noise that the customer was hearing. You see James has a pair of locking pliers holding it steady for him while he turns it. A lot of times we have to take a torch and cut these things off, but he was able to get it by holding it with locking pliers. Alright, there's the bad one out, and we're ready to put the new one in. You can see I had to push up on the sway bar a little bit. Sometimes these can get a little difficult. You might have to have the axle or the suspension hang, but this is a pretty simple one for him to get in place. The sway bar link comes with nylon nuts. That's to lock it in place, because with the suspension there's a lot of vibration and opportunity for the nuts to back off. So if they didn't use lock nuts, they would at least have to use castle nuts with cotter pins, or these things could back off over time. The new one's installed and ready to go. Next time on Bulldog Builds, we'll have the camshaft put in our Fortune tractor engine. We'll have that quarter panel section put in our Honda. And we'll have that Civic taken out for a test drive. See you next week.